Eleanor's fingers dug into the rough wood of the defendant's table as false. Accusations and planted evidence threatened to steal her future and her life. The scarred settler's unwavering gaze from across the crowded courtroom pierced through her terror, recognizing an innocence that would bind their fates forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust rose like a silent prayer beneath the galloping hooves of Matthew Blackwood's chestnut stallion. The unforgiving New Mexico sun beat down upon his weathered hat, the brim pulled low to shield his scarred face from both the harsh elements and curious stares. 3 days on the trail had left him with little more than determination and the haunting silence of the desert for company. Matthew slowed his horse to a steady trot as the silhouette of Redemption Gulch appeared on the horizon, a scattered collection of wooden structures clinging to the land like a desperate man's last hope. The town had grown since his last visit 5 years ago, though its soul remained unchanged. A place where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, and justice came swift and unforgiving. "Almost there, Thunder," he muttered, patting the horse's muscular neck. "Just a short rest, then we press on." The main street stretched before him like an accusation, storefronts lining either side with their weathered signs creaking in the hot breeze. Townsfolk paused their business to cast suspicious glances. His way strangers were never trusted, especially those with faces like his. The left side of Matthew's face bore the angry red scars of a fire that had claimed his home, his family, and whatever softness had once resided within him. He dismounted outside the saloon, tying Thunder to the hitching post. His boots struck the wooden boardwalk with purpose, spurs jingling a quiet warning. Inside, the saloon offered little respite from the heat, but the promise of whiskey was enough to draw him through the batwing doors. Conversation died as he entered. A dozen pairs of eyes tracked his movement to the bar, their gazes lingering on his scars before dropping away when he returned their stares. The barkeep approached cautiously, setting a glass down without being asked. "Been a while, Blackwood," the barkeep said, his voice low. "Thought you'd left these parts for good." Matthew tossed back the amber liquid in one practiced motion. "Just passing through, Sam. Head north. Wouldn't head that way if I were you." Sam leaned closer, voice dropping further. "Marshals gathered a posse. Some woman got herself branded a thief. Stole some fancy heirloom from the mayor's wife. They caught her trying to escape yesterday." Matthew's interest flickered briefly. "And trial's happening right now over at the town hall. They'll likely hang her by sundown." Matthew signaled for another drink, unmoved by the information. The troubles of some foolish woman were none of his concern. He had his own ghost to outrun. The saloon doors burst open, and a boy no older than 12 rushed in, breathless and wild-eyed. "They're gonna hang her," he shouted, "but Mr. Richardson says she didn't do it. Says he's got proof." The saloon emptied in an instant, men rushing out to witness what promised to be the most exciting spectacle Redemption Gulch had seen in months. Matthew remained at the bar, nursing his second whiskey. "Aren't you curious?" Sam asked, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "Seen enough hangings to last a lifetime," Matthew replied, his voice as dry as the desert outside. Yet something, perhaps boredom, perhaps the remnants of the man he once was, pulled him to his feet. He left a coin on the bar and stepped back into the merciless sun, following the crowd toward the town hall at the end of the street. The building stood like a monument to frontier justice, its wooden walls weathered by years of harsh winds and harsh verdicts. Matthew lingered at the back of the gathering crowd, his tall frame allowing him to see over the sea of dusty hats and eager faces. Inside, illuminated by shafts of sunlight streaming through high windows, stood a woman. Her hands were bound before her chin held high despite the circumstances. Even from a distance, Matthew could see the fierce defiance in her posture. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, her features too sharp, her gaze too intense, but something about her commanded attention. Across from her stood a man Matthew recognized as Mayor Hollister, his bulging frame draped in an expensive suit that seemed at odds with the modest surrounding. Beside him, Marshal Tucker presided over the proceeding, his badge catching the light as he gestured for silence. "Eleanor Walsh," the marshal announced, his voice carrying through the packed. "You stand accused of thievery. How do you plead?" "I am innocent," she replied, her voice clear and unwavering. "As I've said from the beginning." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Matthew found himself taking a step forward, then another, moving through the press of bodies until he stood just inside the doorway. "Mrs. Hollister's silver pendant was found in your possession," the marshal continued. "A family heirloom worth more than you could earn in 5 years of honest work." "I never took it," Eleanor insisted. "I was framed." Mayor Hollister stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "This woman worked in our home for 6 months. We took her in, gave her honest work when no one else would, and this is how she repays our charity?" Matthew studied the woman more carefully now. Her simple dress was worn but clean, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot. Despite her bound hands and precarious position, she stood with dignity that seemed incongruous with the thief they painted her to be. "If I wanted to steal from you," Eleanor said, addressing the mayor directly, "why would I still be here? I had ample opportunity to leave town with far more valuable items." "You're not just a thief," Mrs. Hollister shouted from her seat in the front row. a handkerchief clutched dramatically to her mouth. "You're a stupid one." Laughter rippled through the room. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but her gaze remained steady. It was then that an older man pushed his way to the front, his silver hair catching the light. "I have something to say," he announced. "Mr. Richardson," the marshal acknowledged with obvious reluctance. "You're not a witness in this case." "No, but I am the jeweler who sold that pendant to Mayor Hollister 15 years ago," Richardson replied, "and I need to examine the evidence." The marshal hesitated before nodding to a deputy, who brought forward a small wooden box. From it, Richardson carefully lifted a silver pendant, studying it with a practiced eye before looking up gravely. "This is not the same pendant I sold to the mayor," he declared. "This is a poor copy. The craftsmanship is entirely different." The room erupted in chaos. Matthew watched as Eleanor's expression shifted from resignation to confusion to cautious hope. Mayor Hollister sputtered denials while his wife suddenly found great interest in studying her gloved hands. "Silence," the marshal shouted, restoring order with difficulty. "Mr. Richardson, are you certain?" "I've been making jewelry for 40 years, the old man replied. "I know my own work. And this isn't it." Matthew found himself studying not the pendant, but Mrs. Hollister, whose discomfort was becoming increasingly evident. There was something in her nervous fidgeting that stirred his long-dormant instincts. He had spent years hunting men wanted for crimes across the territories, and he recognized guilt when he saw it. As if sensing his scrutiny, Mrs. Hollister's gaze suddenly locked with his. Her eyes widened in recognition not of him personally, but of the danger he represented. She leaned over to whisper urgently to her husband. "I think," Matthew said, his voice cutting through the commotion with unexpected authority, "that someone should check if the real pendant is still in Mars Hollister's jewelry box." All eyes turned to him, taking in his scarred face and the quiet confidence with which he held himself. The marshal narrowed his eyes. "And who might you be, stranger?" "Matthew Blackwood." He stepped forward, conscious of the ripple of recognition his name caused. "Former Texas Ranger." Eleanor Walsh studied him with newfound interest, her eyes meeting his across the room. For a brief, disorienting moment, Matthew felt as if she could see through the hardened exterior he had cultivated so carefully over the years, straight to whatever remnant of his soul still remained. "I never stole anything," she said, speaking directly to him now as if he were the only person in the room who mattered. "Someone is trying to be rid of me." Matthew didn't know why he believed her. Perhaps it was the unwavering steadiness of her gaze, or perhaps it was simply that he had seen enough injustice in his life to recognize its familiar pattern forming once again. Whatever the reason, Matthew Blackwood, who had sworn never again to involve himself in other people's problems, found himself taking yet another step forward. "I think," he said, "this trial needs to continue with a proper investigation." The town hall fell silent as Matthew's words hung in the air. The name Blackwood carried weight in these territories. Stories of his exploits during his ranger days had traveled far, growing more legendary with each retelling. Few recognized the scarred man before them as the same legendary lawman, but the authority in his voice was unmistakable. Marshal Tucker cleared his throat, clearly discomfited by this unexpected development. "Mr. Blackwood, while we appreciate your interest in our proceedings, this is a local matter. A matter of justice is everyone's concern," Matthew replied evenly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's. Something in her gaze had awakened a part of him he'd thought long dead, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Mayor Hollister stepped forward, his face flushed beneath his well-trimmed beard. "This is preposterous. My wife is a woman of impeccable character. To suggest she would frame this ... this servant girl is an insult I won't stand for." "Then you should have no objection to having your home searched," Matthew countered. "If the real pendant is elsewhere, it only proves Miss Walsh's innocence." Mrs. Hollister rose suddenly, swaying slightly. "I'm feeling faint," she announced. "This heat, these accusations. Herbert, please take me home." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "It's the oldest trick in the book, a diversion designed to buy time." "Marshal," he said, "I suggest you assign deputies to accompany them. Ensure nothing is ... misplaced on the journey home." The marshal hesitated, clearly torn between respecting the town's most prominent citizens and pursuing the truth that was increasingly difficult to ignore. "Johnson, Miller," he finally barked at two deputies. "Escort the Hollisters home and remain with them." As the Hollisters were led away, Eleanor's eyes never left Matthew's face. "Why?" she asked softly when he approached the table where she stood. "Why would you help me?" Matthew didn't have a good answer. He'd spent years deliberately avoiding entanglements, keeping human connections at bay. Yet something about her defiance in the face of injustice had pierced the armor he'd built around himself. "I've seen too many innocent people hang," he said simply. The marshal cleared his throat. "Court will recess until the deputies return. Miss Walsh will remain in custody. I'll stand surety for her," Matthew said, surprising himself as much as everyone else. Tucker shook his head. "That's not how we do things here, Blackwood." "Then consider me her guard," Matthew countered. "I'll take responsibility for ensuring she doesn't flee." The marshal studied him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "On your reputation, then, but she doesn't leave your sight." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with this new development, Matthew untied Eleanor's hands. She rubbed her wrists, red marks evidence of how tightly they'd been bound. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "We don't know what they'll find." "I know what they won't find," Evidence that I'm a thief. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime defending herself against unfair accusations. They stepped outside into the harsh afternoon sun, the townsfolk giving them a wide berth as they passed. Matthew led her to the boardwalk's edge, where they could watch the Hollisters' house from a distance. "You're taking a considerable risk for a stranger," Eleanor observed, studying his profile. The scars that marked the left side of his face told a story of pain she could only imagine. "I'm passing through," Matthew replied, his eyes fixed on the Hollister resident. "No risk to me either way, yet you involved yourself." She turned to face him fully. "Mr. Blackwood, Matthew," he corrected, surprising himself again. "Matthew," she repeated, and something in the way his name sounded on her lips made him glance at her. "I need you to know that I have enemies in this town. By standing up for me, you've made them yours as well." He almost smiled at that. "I collected enemies long before I met you, Miss Walsh." "Eleanor," she offered in return. A commotion from the direction of the Hollister house caught their attention. One of the deputies was hurrying back toward the town hall, clutching something in his hand. The crowd that had lingered after the trial immediately converged on him. "They found it," the deputy announced, holding up a silver pendant that caught the sunlight, hidden in a false bottom of Murs. Hollister's jewelry box, just like he said. He nodded toward Matthew. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief washed over her features, softening the tense lines around her mouth. "That's not all," the deputy continued, lowering his voice, though in the eager silence everyone could still hear him. "Mrs. Hollister confessed. Said she planted the fake to get rid of Miss Walsh. Seems the mayor was paying the lady a bit too much attention, if you take my meaning." Murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, a flush of humiliation coloring her cheeks. "So it was jealousy," Matthew said quietly. "She always hated me," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "From the moment I started working there, but I needed the position, and there are few respectable options for a woman alone in these parts." Marshal Tucker pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "Miss Walsh, it appears an injustice was nearly done today. You're free to go, with the town's apologies." The apology rang hollow, coming from the same man who had been prepared to see her hang hours earlier. Eleanor nodded stiffly, accepting the words if not their sincerity. "And the Hollisters?" Matthew asked. "Mrs. Hollister will face charges for her false accusation," Tucker replied. "The mayor claims he knew nothing of his wife's scheme, though that remains to be seen." As the crowd dispersed, Matthew and Eleanor remained on the boardwalk, suddenly awkward in each other's presence now that the immediate crisis had passed. "What will you do now?" Matthew asked, realizing he cared about the answer more than he should. Eleanor gazed down the dusty main street, her future as uncertain as the horizon. "I don't know. My reputation in this town is tarnished, whether I was innocent or not. Few will hire me after this." "You could leave," he suggested. "Start fresh somewhere else." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "With what money? Everything I owned was in my room at the Hollisters. I doubt Mrs. Hollister left much intact after she planted that pendant." Matthew hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Take this," he said, offering it to her. "It's enough to get you to the next town, at least." Eleanor stared at the pouch, but made no move to accept it. "I don't take charity, Mr. Blackwood. It's not charity," he said. "Consider it compensation for a justice system that failed you." Still, she didn't reach for the money. "I won't be indebted to a man I've just met, no matter how noble his intentions." Matthew had to admire her pride, even as it frustrated him. He returned the pouch to his pocket. "Then let me buy you a meal. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." She hesitated before nodding. "That I can accept." They walked in silence to the only proper restaurant in town, a small establishment attached to the hotel. The proprietor, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Bentley, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Table for two," Matthew said, ignoring the woman's obvious interest in the unusual pair they made. The scarred former ranger and the woman who had nearly been hanged as a thief. Once seated, Eleanor studied him openly. "Those scars," she said finally, "they're why you believed me, aren't they? You know what it's like to be judged by appearances." Matthew's hand instinctively rose to the left side of his face before he caught himself and lowered it. "Perhaps. Will you tell me how it happened?" "No," he said, more sharply than he intended. Then softer, "Not today." Eleanor nodded, accepting his boundary. "Fair enough. We all have stories we're not ready to share." They ate in companionable silence, the simple meal of steak and potatoes, the first decent food Eleanor had eaten in days. As they finished, Matthew noticed several townspeople entering the restaurant, their curious gazes fixed on Eleanor. "Word travels fast," he murmured. "And grows with each telling," she replied, setting down her fork. "By morning, I'll have been caught doing far worse than stealing a pendant, and then perhaps you shouldn't be here in the morning." Matthew said, the words emerging before he'd fully considered them. Eleanor looked at him questioningly. "I'm heading north at first light," he continued, committing to the idea even as he spoke it. "You could come along, at least until the next sizable town." "Why would you offer that?" she asked, genuine confusion in her eyes. Matthew wasn't entirely sure himself. 5 years of solitude had suited him well enough. Yet the thought of riding away and leaving her to face the town's judgment alone sat poorly with him. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said finally, "even those who never needed the first." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing his offer against the pride that had sustained her through harder times than these. "North, you said?" she finally asked, a hint of a smile touching her lips for the first time. North, Matthew confirmed, ignoring the warning voice in his head that told him he was making a mistake. We leave at dawn. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as Matthew waited by the livery stable, Thunder saddled and ready beside him. He'd spent a restless night at the hotel, questioning his impulsive offer. He'd ridden alone for years, his scars and reputation keeping others at a comfortable distance. Now he'd invited a woman he barely knew to accompany him on a journey with no clear destination. She won't come, he muttered to Thunder, almost hoping it was true. The horse nickered softly in response, as if disagreeing, but then she appeared, a small carpet bag in one hand, wearing a simple traveling dress and sturdy boots. Her hair was braided and pinned beneath a practical hat, and there was determination in her stride. I wasn't sure you'd come, Matthew admitted as she approached. I wasn't sure either, Eleanor replied honestly, but it seems my options in Redemption Gulch have become rather limited. Matthew nodded toward a chestnut mare tethered beside Thunder. Got her from Johnson at the livery. Said she's gentle, but strong. Eleanor approached the mare carefully, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. She's beautiful, but I can't accept you can pay me back when you're settled somewhere, Matthew interrupted, knowing she would refuse outright charity. Consider it a loan. Eleanor studied him for a moment before nodding. A loan, then. I pay my debts, Mr. Blackwood. Matthew, he reminded her, helping her secure her carpet bag to the saddle. Matthew, she echoed, and again he felt an unexpected warmth at the way his name sounded in her voice. They rode out as the sun crested the horizon, the town still mostly asleep behind. Eleanor didn't look back, her gaze fixed resolutely forward. Matthew found himself wondering what she was leaving behind or running from. Where exactly are we headed? She asked after they'd put several miles between themselves and Redemption Gulch. Silver Creek, Matthew replied. 3 days ride. It's a mining town, but decent, growing. Should be opportunities there. For a woman with a questionable reputation? Her tone was light, but he detected the worry beneath. No one in Silver Creek will know your name or your story unless you choose to tell them, he assured her. They rode in companionable silence for the next hour, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. The terrain gradually shifted from dusty flats to rolling hill, dotted with scrub and the occasional stubborn oak. You ride well, Matthew observed, noticing her easy posture in the saddle. My father raised horses, she replied, a distant look crossing her face, before he lost everything in the war. Matthew nodded, understanding in his silence. Many families had been destroyed by the conflict, their fortunes and futures buried alongside the dead. Virginia, she added, answering his unasked question. We had a small breeding farm outside Richmond. Afterward, there was nothing left. Papa died 2 winters ago. I'm sorry, Matthew said, the words inadequate but sincere. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, visibly setting aside the memories. And you? Were you always a Texas Ranger? Matthew's hand unconsciously rose to touch his scarred cheek. No, ranched with my brother before that. Small spread in the Texas Hill Country. What changed? She asked. His jaw tightened. Higher raiders. I was the only one left. Eleanor didn't press further, recognizing the boundaries of fresh grief even years after the event. They continued riding, the sun climbing higher, the heat building, despite the early spring season. Around midday, they stopped near a small creek to water the horses and rest. Matthew spread a blanket in the shade of a gnarled oak while Eleanor unpacked the simple lunch Mrs. Bentley had prepared for them: bread, cheese, and dried fruit. You've been kind to me, Eleanor said as they ate. Kinder than most would be to a woman in my situation. Matthew shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. I've seen enough injustice to recognize it. During your ranger days? He nodded, tearing a piece of bread. Law isn't always just, especially out here. Is that why you left? She asked. Matthew stared at the horizon, weighing how much to tell her. Partly, he finally said. After my face ... People looked at me differently, feared me more. Made the job easier in some ways, harder in others. And the other part, tired of violence, he admitted, of being the one people called when they needed someone to do their killing for them. Eleanor studied him, seeing beyond the scars to the weight he carried. You're a good man, Matthew Blackwood, he gave a bitter laugh. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment. I know enough, she replied simply. A man's actions speak louder than his history. They finished their meal in silence, each contemplating the unexpected understanding growing between them. As they packed to continue their journey, Matthew noticed a dust cloud in the distance, approaching from the direction of Redemption Gulch. Riders, he said, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. 4, maybe 5. Eleanor's face paled. Do you think they're looking for us? For you, maybe, Matthew replied, quickly helping her into the saddle. We should move. They urged their horses into a canter, leaving the creek behind and heading toward a line of hills where the terrain would offer more cover. Matthew kept glancing back, tracking the dust cloud's progress. They're gaining, he said grimly. Eleanor's eyes widened with fear. Why would they come after me? I was cleared of the charges. Mayor Hollister wouldn't take kindly to the humiliation you caused him and his wife, Matthew. Men like him don't forget Isla. They pushed their horses harder, but the riders behind continued to close the gap. As they reached the first line of hills, Matthew made a quick decision. This way, he directed, guiding them into a narrow ravine that cut between 2 rocky slopes. There's a place up ahead where we can take cover, make a stand if necessary. Eleanor followed without question, trusting his judgment. The ravine wound between steep embankments for nearly half a mile before opening into a small box canyon. At its far end, a cluster of massive boulders shoulders offered natural protection. "Dismount," Matthew instructed, helping Eleanor down. "Take the horses behind those rocks. Stay low." He unsaddled his rifle and checked it methodically, his movements betraying years of practice. Eleanor watched him transform before her eyes, the quiet traveler becoming the formidable ranger once again. "What if they're not hostile?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Matthew's expression was grim. "Then they can state their business from a distance." The sound of hooves echoed in the ravine, growing louder. Matthew positioned himself behind a boulder, rifle ready but not yet raised. "Stay back," he told Eleanor. "If anything happens to me, take Thunder and ride north. Don't stop until you reach Silver Creek." "Matthew," she began, but fell silent as 5 riders emerged from the ravine into the canyon. Matthew recognized the lead rider immediately, Deputy Miller, who had been at the Hollister house the previous day. Beside him rode a man Matthew didn't recognize, expensively dressed despite the dust of travel. The other 3 men had the hard look of hired guns. "That's far enough," Matthew called out when they were 30 yards away. The riders halted, Miller raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "Blackwood, we're not here for trouble." "Then state your business and be on your way," Matthew replied, not lowering his rifle. The well-dressed man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Miss Walsh, my name is James Herring. I'm an attorney from Santa Fe." Eleanor stepped out from behind the rocks, confusion evident on her face. "I don't understand. What business could you possibly have with me?" Harrington reached slowly into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "I've been searching for you for nearly 2 months, Miss Walsh. It concerns your late father's estate." Matthew and Eleanor exchanged puzzled glances. "My father had nothing," Eleanor said. "He died penniless." "On the contrary," Harrington replied. "Shortly before his death, your father acquired partial ownership in a silver mine, a rather profitable one. As his only living heir, you stand to inherit a considerable fortune." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Is this some kind of trick?" Matthew said finally, his rifle still trained on the group. Miller shook his head. "It's legitimate, Blackwood. The attorney arrived in town yesterday asking after Miss Walsh. When he learned what almost happened, he insisted on setting out immediately to find her." Eleanor stepped forward, her legs unsteady. "If what you say is true, why didn't anyone inform me before now? Your father's former partner has been less than forthcoming about your existence," Harrington explained. "He claimed to be the sole owner until documentation proved otherwise. He's been quite determined to keep you from claiming your inheritance." "How determined?" Matthew asked sharply. Harrington's expression turned grim. "There have been 2 previous attorneys sent to find Miss Walsh. Neither returned to Santa Fe." The implication hung heavy in the air. Lenore's near hanging in Redemption Gulch suddenly took on a more sinister aspect, not simply a jealous woman's scheme, but perhaps something far more calculated. "Who is this partner?" Eleanor demanded, her voice stronger now. Harrington hesitated, glancing at Matthew. "Man named Victor Sullivan. Believe you may be acquainted with him, Mr. Blackwood." Matthew's scarred face hardened to stone. The name landed like a physical blow, dredging up memories he'd long tried to bury. "Sullivan," he repeated, the name bitter on his tongue. Eleanor looked between them, sensing the shift in Matthew's demeanor. "You know him?" Matthew lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes distant. "Yes," he said finally. "He's the man who took everything from me, the man who left me for dead in the ashes of my home." The canyon fell silent as the full implications settled over them. What had begun as a simple journey north had suddenly become something far more complicated and dangerous. Night had fallen by the time they made camp several miles from the Box Canyon. The attorney Harrington had insisted on accompanying them, while Deputy Miller and his men had returned to Redemption Gulch with promises to send word if anyone suspicious came looking for Eleanor. A small fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows across their faces. Eleanor sat wrapped in a blanket. The documents Harrington had brought spread across her lap. They told a story she could scarcely believe. Her father, in his final desperate months, had staked everything on a mining claim that had proven unexpectedly rich. "I still don't understand," she said, looking up at Harrington. "If my father died 2 years ago, why am I only hearing of this now?" Harrington adjusted his spectacles, his scholarly demeanor at odds with their rugged surrounding. "Your father's correspondence indicates he sent you letters about the claim, but I suspect they were intercepted. When he fell ill, he filed proper documentation naming you his beneficiary. Sullivan has been using various legal maneuvers to prevent the execution of the will." "And the other attorneys?" Matthew asked from where he stood at the edge of the firelight, his scarred profile harsh in the golden glow. "Found dead," Harrington replied grimly. "Apparent robberies or accidents, but the timing was suspicious." Single quotes. Eleanor folded the papers carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "How much is the claim worth?" "Based on recent production reports, her 30% share would yield approximately $5,000 annually." The sum was staggering, more money than Eleanor had ever imagined possessing. She looked toward Matthew, seeking some anchor in this sea of unexpected change, but his attention was fixed on the darkness beyond their camp. "Sullivan won't stop," Matthew said finally, his voice low. "Not until he has full control of that mine." "You seem quite certain of his character," Harrington observed. Matthew turned, the firelight catching the ravaged side of his face. I know Victor Sullivan better than most. Will you tell me now? Eleanor asked softly. How you know him? Matthew was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might refuse again. Then he moved closer to the fire and sat heavily on a fallen log. 8 years ago, my brother and I owned a cattle ranch in Texas, he began, his voice flat as if reciting facts about strangers. Good land, good water. Sullivan wanted it for a railway connection. We refused to sell. Eleanor watched as his hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. One night, men came, set fire to our home while we slept. My brother ... his wife, their 2 children ... single quotes Matthew's voice caught. I tried to save them. That's how I got these. He gestured to the scars that marred the left side of his face. God, Harrington murmured. I survived, barely. Spent months recovering. When I was strong enough, I joined the Rangers to learn how to track men like the ones who destroyed my family. His eyes, reflecting the firelight, seemed to burn with a dark memory. It took 3 years, but I found them. 3 hired killers who admitted Sullivan had paid them. You caught them? Eleanor asked. Matthew's expression hardened. I found them. They didn't live to stand trial. The implications of his statement hung heavy in the night air. Eleanor should have been frightened by this revelation of violence and the quiet man who had come to her aid, but instead she felt a strange sense of understanding. And Sullivan? Harrington prompted. By then he'd become powerful. Had friends in government, witnesses who swore he was elsewhere when the orders were given. The case fell apart. Single quotes Matthew's voice had gone cold. I resigned from the Rangers after that. Couldn't stomach the law anymore. Eleanor moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And now our paths cross because of the same man. Seems like fate has a cruel sense of humor. Matthew replied. Harrington cleared his throat. This connection complicates matters. Sullivan will be doubly determined if he learns you two are traveling together. He already knows, Matthew said with certainty. The attempted hanging in Redemption Gulch was too convenient. Sullivan has always worked through others, keeping his own hands clean. Then what do we do? Eleanor asked, fighting to keep the fear from her voice. We keep moving, Matthew replied, his eyes meeting hers across the small distance between them. But not to Silver Creek. It's too obvious a destination. Where then? There's a judge in territorial court who once helped me build the case against Sullivan, Judge Hammond. He's in Santa Fe now. If anyone can help secure your claim legally, it's him. Harrington nodded slowly. Hammond has a reputation for integrity. It's a sound plan. We'll need to be careful, Matthew continued. Travel by less obvious routes. Avoid towns when possible. I'll slow you down, Eleanor said. Perhaps Mr. Harrington should take me to Santa Fe directly while you— No, Matthew interrupted, more forcefully than he intended. More quietly, he added, Sullivan's men will be watching the main roads. And Harrington here, while well-intentioned, isn't equipped to deal with the kind of men Sullivan employs. The attorney didn't argue the point, clearly aware of his limitations in this frontier world of violence. We stay together, Matthew concluded, his tone brooking no argument. Eleanor nodded, oddly comforted by his decisiveness. Despite the danger, there was security in knowing this scarred, quiet man was committed to her safety. As the night deepened, Harrington retired to his bedroll, leaving Matthew and Eleanor sitting by the dying fire. The silence between them was different now, charged with shared purpose and unspoken understanding. I'm sorry, Eleanor said finally. About your family. Matthew stared into the embers. Been a long time. Some wounds never fully heal, she observed. They just become part of who we are. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the surface for the first time. You sound like you know something about that. Eleanor smiled sadly. My father was a proud man. After we lost everything, he ... changed, became bitter, angry. The war took more than our property. It took his spirit. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I watched him disappear into grief and rage until there was almost nothing left of the man I knew. Is that why you left Virginia? After he died, there was nothing to stay for. I thought I could make a new beginning out west. A humorless laugh escaped her. Instead, I found myself working for people like the Hollisters, always one accusation away from ruin. Matthew nodded his understanding. They sat in companionable silence, 2 wounded souls finding unexpected resonance in each other's pain. You should get some rest, he said eventually. We'll leave before dawn. Eleanor hesitated, then reached out impulsively to touch his hand. Thank you, not just for helping me, but for trusting me with your story. His hand tensed beneath hers for a moment before relaxing. The simple human contact seemed to surprise him, as if he'd grown unaccustomed to gentle touch. It's been a long time since I've talked about it, he admitted. A long time since I've had someone to talk to at all. In the fading firelight, Eleanor could see both the strength and vulnerability in his face, the hardness life had forged in him, but also the humanity that remained despite everything he'd endured. The scars that might have repulsed another woman only made her see more clearly the courage beneath them. We'll face Sullivan together, she promised. Whatever comes. Matthew didn't pull his hand away. Get some sleep, Eleanor. Tomorrow will be a long day. She reluctantly withdrew her hand and stood, gathering her blanket around her shoulders. Good night, Matthew. As she settled into her bedroll a short distance away, Eleanor found herself studying the silhouette of Matthew against the night sky as he took the first watch. There was something comforting in his vigilance, in knowing he was standing guard while she slept. Despite the revelations of the day and the danger that pursued them, Eleanor fell asleep more peacefully peacefully than she had in years, with the unexpected sense that she was no longer alone in the world. Matthew watched her from his position at the camp's edge, noting how her breathing eventually slowed and deepened. The protectiveness he felt surprised him. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to care about another person's welfare. Caring made you vulnerable, and vulnerability got people killed. Yet here he was, placing himself directly in Sullivan's path once again, not just for vengeance now, but to protect this woman he barely knew. A woman whose quiet strength and dignity had somehow breached walls he'd thought impenetrable. As the stars wheeled overhead, Matthew contemplated the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. If he believed in such things, he might have called it providence that Eleanor's path should cross his just when Sullivan had re-entered both their lives. But Matthew Blackwood had stopped believing in providence the night he watched his family burn. Instead, he believed in what he could touch and see: his gun, his horse, the open trail, and now perhaps in the sleeping woman whose future had unexpectedly entangled with his own. He checked his revolver methodically, comforted by the familiar weight of it. Whatever Sullivan had planned, Matthew would be ready. This time he wouldn't fail. They traveled for 3 days, keeping to less traveled paths and avoiding settlements. Harrington had reluctantly parted ways with them on the second morning, carrying letters from Eleanor that would officially begin the legal process of claiming her inheritance. The attorney would take the main road to Santa Fe, drawing attention away from their more circuitous route through the Badlands. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they pushed northward, jagged mesas rising from the desert floor, deep arroyos cutting across their path like ancient scars on the land. It was harsh country, unforgiving to those who didn't respect its power. But Matthew moved through it with the confidence of a man who had made peace with its dangers. Eleanor followed his lead without complaint, though the long hours in the saddle had taken their toll. Her mare, whom she'd named Penny for her copper coat, had proven a steady and reliable mount, adapting to Eleanor's riding style with an intuitive ease. They made camp in the shelter of a sandstone overhang as the sun began its descent behind the western ridges. Eleanor dismounted stiffly, her muscles protesting after the day's journey. "There's a spring about 50 yards that way," Matthew said, nodding toward a cluster of cottonwoods in the distance. "Should be safe enough for you to wash up. I'll see to the horses." Eleanor nodded gratefully, gathering her small bundle of personal items. The prospect of cool water against her dust-covered skin was too tempting to resist despite her fatigue. The spring was small but clear, feeding a shallow pool before disappearing again beneath the rocky ground. Eleanor glanced around to ensure her privacy, then quickly removed her travel-worn clothes and stepped into the water. She gasped at the cold, but welcomed its bracing clarity as she scrubbed the dust from her skin and rinsed her hair. As she bathed, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the man who had become her unexpected protector. In the days they'd traveled together, she'd observed how Matthew's gruff exterior softened in quiet moments, when he helped her over difficult terrain, when he shared stories of the land they passed through, when he occasionally allowed himself the ghost of a smile at something she said. The scars that marked him went deeper than his skin, she knew. He carried wounds of the soul that hadn't healed, kept open by his solitary existence and his unresolved past. Yet there was gentleness in him too, in the way he tended to the horses, in the careful way he built their fires each night, in how his eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't aware. Eleanor dressed in her cleanest remaining clothes and made her way back to camp, her damp hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Matthew had already built a small fire and was preparing a simple meal of jerky, beans, and hardtack. "Better?" he asked as she approached. "Like a new woman," she replied, settling onto a blanket he'd spread near the fire. "Though I'd give almost anything for a proper bath and a real bed. Santa Fe's only 4 days' ride if we push hard," Matthew said, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "You'll have both soon enough." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a fleeting touch that nonetheless sent a current through Eleanor. She'd begun to notice these moments more acutely, the casual contacts that seemed to affect them both more than either acknowledged. "You know Santa Fe well?" she asked, sipping the strong, bitter brew. Matthew nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "Spent time there during my ranger days. It's grown since then, but the old Spanish section hasn't changed much. Good people, mostly. Judge Hammond, you trust him completely?" A shadow crossed Matthew's face. "As much as I trust anyone in a position of authority. Hammond was the only one who believed me about Sullivan back then, tried to help build the case before it fell apart." "What will you do?" Eleanor asked quietly. "After we reach Santa Fe and secure my claim?" The question hung between them, giving voice to the uncertainty that awaited beyond their immediate goal. Matthew's eyes met hers across the firelight, and for once he didn't look away. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For years I've just been existing, moving from place to place, taking odd jobs when money ran low. Because of Sullivan? Partly." Matthew set his coffee aside. "But partly because I didn't see much point in building something new. Not after losing everything once already." Eleanor considered his words, understanding the fear that lay beneath them. Fear not of death or danger, but of attachment, of caring too much about something that could be taken away. "That's no way to live," she said gently. "No," he agreed after a moment. "It's just surviving." They finished their meal in contemplative silence, each lost in private thoughts as the stars appeared overhead, brilliant against the darkening sky. Matthew took the first watch as usual, his rifle across his knees as he sat with his back against a boulder. Eleanor arranged her bedroll, suddenly reluctant to end the day. These quiet evenings had become precious to her, moments of connection in the vast emptiness of their journey. "Matthew," she said, propping herself up on one elbow, "would you tell me something? Something good from before?" He looked over at her, his expression questioning. "From before the fire," she clarified. "A happy memory. Sometimes it helps to remember there was light before the darkness." Matthew was silent so long that Eleanor thought he might refuse. Then he spoke, his voice soft in the night. "There was a creek on our property. In spring it would overflow its banks, create this small island in the middle. My brother and I built a fort there when we were boys." A faint smile touched his lip. "Spent whole summers defending it against imaginary outlaws and Indian raids." Eleanor smiled, picturing a younger Matthew, unmarked by tragedy, playing with his brother in the dappled sunlight of a Texas creek. "My mother would ring a dinner bell when it was time to come home," he continued, the memory unfolding as he spoke. "You could hear it clear across the property. No matter how deep in our adventures we were, that bell always brought us running." "She sounds wonderful," Eleanor said. She was. Matthew's voice held warmth now. Tough as rawhide, but gentle too. Could quote Shakespeare while mending fence posts. Said education mattered, even out on the frontier. "My mother was similar," Eleanor offered. "She taught me to read from her family Bible and a collection of English poetry. Said a lady needed cultivation of mind as well as manners." They shared a look of understanding, two people who had lost not just family but a way of life, a sense of belonging that could never be fully recaptured. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for sharing that." Single quotes. Matthew nodded, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "Get some rest. I'll wake you for second watch." Eleanor settled onto her bedroll, the sound of Matthew's voice lingering in her mind as she drifted towards sleep. The barriers between them were lowering, one memory, one conversation at a time. She woke suddenly hours later, not to Matthew's gentle rousing for her watch, but to his hand firmly covering her mouth. His face was inches from hers, his expression alert and tense in the faint moonlight. "Riders," he whispered, removing his hand once he was sure she was fully awake. Coming up from the south. Eleanor sat up quickly, suddenly aware of the distant sound of hoofbeats. Sullivan's men? Likely 6, maybe 7 horses. Matthew was already gathering their belongings, moving with practiced efficiency. "We need to move." Now they broke camp in minutes, leaving no trace of their fire. Matthew helped Eleanor onto Penny's back, then mounted Thunder with fluid grace despite the urgency of their situation. "There's a box canyon about 2 miles north," he said, voice low as they began moving through the darkness. "Narrow entrance, steep walls, defensible if it comes to that." "And if they follow us in?" Eleanor asked, fear sharpening her senses. Matthew's hand went to his rifle. "Then they've made a serious mistake." They rode hard through the night, the terrain treacherous even for experienced riders. Eleanor focused on staying in the saddle, trusting Penny to follow Thunder's lead through the darkness. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. The canyon appeared ahead, a darker shadow against the night sky. As they approached its narrow mouth, Matthew suddenly reined Thunder to a halt, causing Eleanor to pull up beside him. "What is it?" she asked, breath. Matthew's eyes were fixed on the canyon entrance. "Torchlight. Someone's already there." Eleanor's heart sank. "We're trapped." "Not yet." Matthew scanned their surroundings, making a quick decision. "This way." He led them east, toward a ridge of broken boulders. As they rode, the sound of pursuit changed, splitting, with some riders continuing toward the canyon while others turned to follow their new direction. "They're trying to cut us off," Eleanor realized. "We'll reach those rocks before they catch us," Matthew assured her, though the grim set of his jaw suggested he was less certain than his words implied. They pushed the horses harder, the animals responding valiantly to their riders' urgency. The rocky outcropping loomed closer, promising at least temporary shelter from their pursuers. A shot cracked through the night, the bullet whistling past Eleanor's head close enough that she felt its passage. She instinctively ducked lower in the saddle as Matthew reached for his rifle. "Keep riding," he shouted, twisting to fire at the shadowy figures behind them. The exchange of gunfire continued as they reached the rocks. Matthew leapt from his horse, helping Eleanor dismount before leading both animals behind a large boulder. "Stay down," he ordered, positioning himself at the edge of their shelter. Eleanor pressed herself against the cool stone, heart pounding as bullets struck the rocks around them. The riders had stopped their advance, spreading out in a loose semicircle just beyond effective rifle range. 7 men, Matthew reported after a careful assessment, well armed. "Can we hold them off until morning?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Matthew's expression was solemn in the faint moonlight. "They'll rush us before dawn. Sullivan's men don't like to leave witnesses." The gravity of their situation settled over Eleanor. They were outnumbered, with limited ammunition and nowhere to run. For the first time since leaving Redemption Gulch, she felt true despair threatening to overwhelm her. Matthew must have seen it in her face, for he moved closer, taking her hand in his. "I won't let them take you," he promised, his voice low and fierce, "whatever happens." The unexpected tenderness in his gesture gave Eleanor courage. She squeezed his hand in return. "We'll face them together." Dawn was still hours away, the night holding them in its dark embrace as Matthew and Eleanor crouched behind their rocky shelter. The standoff had settled into an uneasy stalemate, occasional shots from Sullivan's men keeping them pinned down, while Matthew's precise return fire prevented any direct assault. "They're conserving ammunition," Matthew observed, his voice a low rumble beside her, waiting us out. Eleanor tightened her grip on the small derringer he had given her. A lady's gun with just 2 shots, but better than nothing if it came to close quarters. The weight of it felt foreign in her hand, a tangible reminder of how far she had traveled from the genteel world of her Virginia upbringing. Could we make a break for it? She whispered. In the darkness, Matthew shook his head. They've got us surrounded. Horses would be shot out from under us before we made 50 yards. He checked his ammunition pouch. I've got 17 rounds left, not enough to fight our way clear. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. Then what do we do? Before he could answer, a voice called out from the darkness. Blackwood, I know. That's you in there with the Walsh woman. The voice was cultured, almost pleasant, with the faintest hint of a southern drawl. This doesn't have to end badly for either of you. Matthew tensed beside her. Sullivan, he breathed, his hand instinctively tightening around his rifle. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. The man himself had come, not just his hired guns. How did he find us so quickly? She whispered. He's had years to build his network, Matthew replied. Eyes and ears in every town between here and Texas. His jaw tightened. And now he's decided to handle things personally. Sullivan's voice came again, closer now. Miss Walsh, your father was a business associate of mine. I've merely been safeguarding your inheritance until you could be located. There's no need for this unpleasantness. He's lying, Eleanor said, loud enough for her voice to carry across the rocks. My father would never willingly associate with a man like you. A chuckle drifted through the darkness. Your father was a desperate man when I found him, Miss Walsh. Desperate men rarely choose their associates wisely. Matthew placed a restraining hand on Eleanor's arm when she would have responded again. Don't engage him, he warned. That's what he wants. Sullivan continued as if he'd heard Matthew's caution. Blackwood, after all these years. Still nursing old grudges, I see. I've always regretted how things ended between us. He's trying to provoke you, Eleanor murmured, seeing the tight control in Matthew's face. I know. Matthew's voice was steady, but she could feel the tension radiating from it. Sullivan always did prefer to talk his opponents to death before killing them. I'm offering you both a chance to walk away, Sullivan called. Miss Walsh, you sign over your claim to the mine, and in return, I'll provide you with enough money to start a new life elsewhere. Blackwood, you ride out now, and we'll consider our old score settled. Matthew's laugh held no humor. And if we refuse? Then neither of you will see the sunrise, Sullivan replied, all pretense of civility gone from his voice. My men are getting impatient, and I've never been known for my forbearance. Eleanor moved closer to Matthew, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. He's going to kill us either way, isn't he? She whispered. Yes, Matthew answered simply. But not if I kill him first. She studied his profile in the dim starlight, the hard set of his jaw, the steady resolve in his eyes. This man had become her protector, her companion, perhaps something more. In the short time they had traveled together, the thought of losing him now was suddenly unbearable. Matthew, she said softly, whatever happens, I'm glad fate brought us together, even like this. He turned to her, his expression softening for a moment as his eyes met hers. Eleanor, a gunshot interrupted whatever he had been about to say, the bullet striking uncomfortably close to their position. Matthew pulled her lower behind the rocks as more shots followed. They're moving in, he said grimly, raising his rifle to return fire. The night erupted in gunfire, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness in brief, violent bursts. Eleanor pressed herself against the cold stone, heart pounding as bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them. Matthew fired methodically, each shot deliberate and precise. 3 times she heard distant cries as his bullets found their marks. I count 4 still out there, he reported during a lull in the shooting, plus Sullivan. We can't hold out much longer, Eleanor said, fear and resignation warring within her. Matthew checked his ammunition again. 7 rounds left. He hesitated, then looked at her intently. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. This isn't the time for last confessions, she protested. It might be the only time we have. His voice was urgent now, stripped of its usual reserve. I've spent years alone, convinced I'd never feel anything again after what happened to my family. Then you walked into that courtroom and somehow ... single quotes, he faltered, words failing. Instead, he reached out, his scarred hand gently cupping her cheek. Eleanor leaned into his touch, understanding what he couldn't articulate. In the midst of danger, with death pressing close, the barriers between them had finally fallen away completely. I know, she whispered. I feel it too. Single quotes. Matthew's eyes held hers for a moment longer before he reluctantly withdrew his hand and turned back to their desperate situation. There's one chance, he said, his tactician's mind reasserting itself. If I can draw their fire, create a diversion, you might be able to reach the horses. And leave you here? Eleanor shook her head vehemently. I won't do it. Eleanor, no, she interrupted. We stay together. Whatever comes, we face it together. The determination in her voice seemed to reach him, and after a moment he nodded. Together then. Another volley of gunfire peppered their position, closer now as Sullivan's men gained confidence. Matthew returned fire sparingly, aware of his dwindling ammunition. Then from somewhere to the east, a new sound reached them, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, growing steadily louder. Reinforcements? Eleanor whispered, hope flaring briefly. Matthew listened intently, his expression wary. Too many horses. The newcomers crested a ridge several hundred yards away, silhouetted against the night sky, a dozen riders moving at speed toward their position. Even Sullivan's men had noticed, their gunfire tapering off in uncertainty. U.S. Cavalry, Matthew realized, recognizing the formation even in the darkness. Sullivan's voice cut through the night again, this time with unmistakable urgency. Finish them now, before the soldiers arrive. The remaining gunmen rushed forward, abandoning caution in a final desperate assault. Matthew rose to meet them, firing deliberately until his rifle clicked empty. Without hesitation, he drew his revolver, stepping protectively in front of Eleanor. Two of Sullivan's men fell before they reached the rocks. A third stumbled forward, gun raised only to collapse as Matthew's bullet found his heart. The fourth man managed to reach their position, lunging over the boulder with a savage cry. Matthew met him head-on, his empty revolver becoming a club as he struck the man across the temple. The gunman staggered but didn't fall, slashing out with a wicked hunting knife that gleamed in the starlight. Matthew caught his wrist. The two men locked in a desperate struggle. Eleanor watched in horror as they grappled at the edge of the rocks, neither gaining the advantage. Then she saw Sullivan himself approaching from behind, pistol raised toward Matthew's unprotected back. Without thinking, she raised her derringer and fired. The small gun bucked in her hand, its report almost lost amid the larger battle. Sullivan stumbled, clutching his shoulder, his shot going wild, his face contorted with rage as he swung his pistol toward her. Before he could fire, the night was split by a bugle call. The cavalry had arrived, riding hard toward their position with rifles drawn. Sullivan hesitated, then turned and fled back into the darkness. Matthew finally gained the upper hand, driving his opponent to the ground with a powerful blow. The man lay still, either unconscious or dead. Eleanor couldn't tell in the confusion. Sullivan? Matthew demanded, breathing hard as he retrieved his fallen revolver. I shot him, Eleanor said, still stunned by her own action. In the shoulder. He ran when the soldiers appeared. Matthew's expression darkened. He won't get far. The cavalry thundered to a halt nearby, their officers shouting orders as soldiers fanned out to secure the area. A familiar figure rode at their head, Deputy Miller from Redemption Gulch. Blackwood, Miller called, dismounting quickly. Thank God we found you. How did you know where to look? Matthew asked, helping Eleanor to her feet. Harrington sent word from Santa Fe, Miller explained. Said Sullivan's men were asking about you all along the main road. We figured you'd take the cutoff through the Badlands. Eleanor leaned against Matthew, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and the aftermath of fear. His arm went around her waist, supporting her without hesitation. Sullivan's wounded and on the run, Matthew told Miller, heading west. The deputy nodded, already signaling to several soldiers. We'll find him. Judge Hammond sent these men personally when he heard Sullivan was involved. There's a warrant for his arrest in 3 territories. As the soldiers organized a pursuit party, Miller studied Matthew and Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. You two have been through hell from the looks of it. Matthew's arm tightened protectively around Eleanor's waist. We made it through together. Miller tactfully changed the subject. We've got spare horses and supplies. Can get you to Santa Fe by tomorrow evening if we push hard. Santa Fe, Eleanor repeated, the word sounding strange after the night's ordeal. Their destination, their goal, suddenly real again. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Eleanor found herself watching the horizon with renewed hope. They had survived the night against impossible odds. Sullivan was wounded and pursued by soldiers. The path to her inheritance and perhaps a future she'd never dared imagine lay open before them. She looked up at Matthew, finding his eyes already on her. The connection between them had been forged in danger and deepened in the face of death. What it might become in the light of day, with the immediate threat removed, remained to be seen. But as the sun's first rays touched his scarred face, transforming it with golden light, Eleanor knew with sudden clarity that she didn't want to face that new day or any day without him beside her. Santa Fe rose before them like a mirage as they crested the final ridges sprawling settlement of adobe. Buildings and wooden structures nestled against the distant mountains. The cavalry escort had departed that morning, continuing their pursuit of Sullivan, while Miller remained to accompany Matthew and Eleanor to the territorial capital. Eleanor took in the sight with weary appreciation. After days on the trail and the harrowing night in the Badlands, civilization, even the rough frontier variety, seemed like an impossible luxury. Not much further now, Matthew said, riding close beside her. Since the attack, he had rarely strayed from her side, as if physical proximity could ensure her continued safety. They entered the town as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets. Santa Fe was unlike any place Eleanor had yet seen in the West, a curious blend of Spanish, native, and American influences that gave the settlement a character all its own. Adobe buildings with flat roofs stood alongside more traditional wooden structures, while the central plaza buzzed with activity as traders and locals conducted their business. Miller led them to a modest hotel near the courthouse. Judge Hammond's expecting you tomorrow morning, he informed them as they dismounted. I sent word ahead. Thank you, Eleanor said, finding the words inadequate for all the deputy had done. For everything, single quotes, Miller tipped his hat. Just glad we got there in time, Miss Walsh, he turned to Matthew. Blackwood, I'll stop by in the morning to escort you both to the courthouse. These streets might look civilized, but Sullivan has friends even here. After Miller departed, they secured adjoining rooms and arranged for hot baths to be brought up, simple luxuries that seemed almost decadent after their journey. Eleanor sank into the steaming water with a sigh of pure relief, letting the heat soothe her aching muscles and wash away the dust of travel. As she bathed, she found herself thinking of Matthew in the next room, wondering if he too was taking comfort in this small return to civilization. The man she had come to know over the past week was a contradiction. Hard yet gentle, distant yet protective, scarred yet still capable of tenderness. Their connection had grown from necessity into something deeper, something neither had anticipated. Later, dressed in the cleanest clothes she possessed, Eleanor joined Matthew for dinner in the hotel's small dining room. He had made an effort with his appearance as well, his dark hair damp from his bath, his face freshly shaved except for the neat mustache that partially obscured his scarred lip. "You look ... single quotes," he began, then seemed to struggle for the right word. "Clean?" she suggested with a small smile. A hint of warmth touched his eyes. Beautiful. The simple compliment brought color to her cheeks. They ate their meal, the first properly cooked food they'd had in days, with a comfortable familiarity that belied their brief acquaintance. "What happens tomorrow?" Eleanor asked as they finished their meal. Matthew's expression grew serious. "Hammond will hear your case, with Harrington's documentation and your father's paper. Establishing your claim should be straightforward, but ... but Sullivan isn't finished." She completed the thought. He nodded. Even with the cavalry after him, a man like that always has contingencies. Lawyers, bought witnesses, corrupt officials. Do you think he'll risk coming to Santa Fe himself? "Not while he's wounded and being hunted," Matthew replied, "but his influence reaches far. We need to be prepared for anything." They retired early, the comfort of real beds too tempting to resist after days of sleeping on the hard ground. But Eleanor found sleep elusive, despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to the moment in the Badlands when Matthew had nearly confessed his feelings, and to her own surprising certainty about what she felt for him. Morning arrived with clear skies and renewed purpose. Eleanor dressed in her most presentable attire, a modest blue dress that had somehow survived the journey relatively unscathed. When she emerged from her room, she found Matthew waiting in the hallway, his appearance as formal as his limited wardrobe would allow. Miller arrived as promised, accompanying them through the busy streets to the imposing courthouse that stood at the north end of the plaza. The building's architecture reflected Santa Fe's Spanish heritage, a two-story adobe structure with heavy wooden doors and a covered portico supported by rough-hewn timber columns. Inside, the corridors bustled with activity lawyers in dark suits, clerks carrying stacks of documents, citizens awaiting their turn before the territorial justice system. Miller led them to a bench outside Judge Hammond's court. "Wait here," he instructed. "I'll let Hammond know you've arrived." As they waited, Eleanor noticed Matthew growing increasingly tense, his eyes constantly scanning the corridor, hand never far from where his revolver would normally be, though he had left it at the hotel, the courthouse being no place for firearms. "You're expecting trouble," she observed quietly. "Always," he replied. Then softening slightly, he added, "Old habits." Before she could respond, the courtroom doors opened and a clerk emerged. "Judge Hammond will see Miss Walsh and Emma Blackwood now." The courtroom was smaller than Eleanor had expected. Simple wooden benches arranged before an elevated judge's bench. Morning light streamed through high windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. A few spectators occupied the back benches, local lawyers and citizens drawn by the promise of an interesting case. Judge Hammond was a man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and penetrating blue eyes beneath bushy brows. He nodded in recognition as Matthew approached. "Blackwood," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Been a long time." "Yes, sir," Matthew replied with unexpected deference. The judge turned his attention to Eleanor. "And you must be Miss Walsh. I've reviewed the documents your attorney forwarded. Quite a situation you find yourself in." "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor responded. Summoning the poise her mother had instilled in her during happier days in Virginia, Hammond gestured to the tables before his bench. "Please be seated. This isn't a formal hearing yet, just a preliminary discussion." They had just taken their seats when the courtroom doors opened again. Eleanor turned to see a distinguished man in an expensive suit enter, accompanied by two clerks carrying document boxes. "Ah, Mr. Chambers," Judge Hammond acknowledged. "I was wondering if you'd appear." "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor," the newcomer replied smoothly. "I've only just been retained to represent Mr. Sullivan's interests in this matter." Matthew's body tensed beside Eleanor. "Sullivan's lawyer," he whispered, his voice tight with controlled anger. Judge Hammond gestured for Chambers to join them. "As I was explaining to Miss Walsh, this is merely an informal discussion before we proceed to a proper hearing." Chambers set his briefcase on the table opposite Eleanor and Matthew. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe we can resolve this matter without the need for formal proceedings. My client is prepared to make a most generous offer to Miss Walsh." "Is he?" Hammond's bushy eyebrows rose. "And where is your client, Mr. Chambers? I understand the territorial cavalry is quite interested in his whereabouts." The lawyer maintained his composure. Quote, "Mr. Sullivan has been unavoidably detained by business matters. He has, however, authorized me to act with full discretion on his behalf, including answering for the ambush of Miss Walsh and Merson Blackwood in the Badland," Hammond asked pointedly. Chambers affected an expression of shock. "My client categorically denies any involvement in such a regrettable coincidence. If Miss Walsh was indeed attacked, it was surely by common bandits who plagued those remote areas. Matthew half rose from his seat before Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. She could feel the tension radiating through him, his patience with legal niceties wearing thin after years of seeking justice through more direct means. Hammond seemed to sense the brewing confrontation. Before we proceed further, I believe we should formally establish Miss Walsh's claim. Chambers, your objections can be heard after the facts are presented. For the next hour, Eleanor's father's documentation was examined in detail. Harrington had done his work well, assembling a compelling paper trail that proved beyond doubt that Jonathan Walsh had indeed owned a 30% share in the Silver Crescent mine, and that Eleanor was his sole legal heir. Chambers attempted several objections, citing technical issues with the paperwork and suggesting that Sullivan had entered into a verbal agreement with Walsh that superseded the written contract. Each objection was methodically overruled by Hammond, whose patience visibly thinned with each interruption. Based on the documentation before me, Hammond finally declared, "I see no reason to doubt Miss Walsh's claim to her father's share of the mine. Miss Chambers, unless you can produce compelling evidence to the contrary, this court is inclined to rule in her favor." Chambers leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Your Honor, before you make such a determination, there is a matter of Miss Walsh's character that the court should consider." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Beside her, Matthew went completely still. "My client has obtained sworn affidavits from residents of Redemption Gulch." Chambers continued, withdrawing several documents from his briefcase. "They attest that Miss Walsh was employed in the Hollister household, where she was caught stealing valuable items. While charges were ultimately dropped, the incident speaks to a pattern of opportunistic behavior that casts doubt on the legitimacy of her claim." "That's a lie," Matthew growled, his composure finally breaking. "She was framed by MRs. Hollister out of jealousy. The real pendant was found hidden in their house." Judge Hammond held up a hand for silence. "I'm aware of the Redemption Gulch incident, Mr. Chambers." Deputy Miller provided a full report. "Your attempt to impugn Miss Walsh's character is both transparent and irrelevant to the matter of inheritance." Chambers' smile tightened. "Nevertheless, Your Honor, in the interest of avoiding a prolonged legal battle that would benefit no one, my client is prepared to offer Miss Walsh $5,000 to relinquish all claims to the mine." Eleanor straightened in her chair. "I decline," she said firmly before Hammond could respond. "I have no intention of surrendering what is rightfully mine, especially not to a man who tried to have me killed." The courtroom fell silent at her direct accusation. Chambers' face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "A serious allegation, Miss Walsh," Hammond observed. "One I'm prepared to substantiate," she replied, drawing strength from Matthew's presence beside her. "I believe Mr. Sullivan's actions constitute a pattern of criminal behavior dating back to the murder of the Blackwood family in Texas 8 years ago." The mention of the Blackwood murders sent a ripple through the courtroom spectator. Judge Hammond's expression darkened as he turned his gaze to Matthew. "We've traveled down this road before, Blackwood," he said quietly. "This time will be different," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "This time I have a witness." Judge Hammond's chambers were more intimate than the court, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk dominated by stacks of legal documents. The judge had called for a private meeting after Matthew's declaration, recognizing that the allegations against Sullivan extended far beyond a simple inheritance dispute. "You claim to have a witness," Hammond said, settling into his chair and fixing Matthew with a penetrating stare. "To events that occurred 8 years ago?" "Not to the original murders," Matthew clarified, "but to Sullivan's more recent crimes and his admission of past ones." Eleanor sat beside Matthew, acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. This was about more than her inheritance now. It was about justice long delayed. "Murrah, Chambers has been asked to wait outside," Hammond continued. "But before we proceed further, I need to understand exactly what you're alleged." "Blackwood." Matthew leaned forward, the scars on his face thrown into sharp relief by the sunlight streaming through the window. "One of Sullivan's men survived the ambush in the Badlands. Deputy Miller has him in custody. He's willing to testify that Sullivan personally ordered our deaths." Hammond's bushy eyebrows rose. "And why would this hired gun turn on his employer?" "Because Sullivan left him to die," Eleanor interjected. "The cavalry was closing in, and Sullivan fled without a backward glance. There's a certain honor even among thieves," Matthew added. "Sullivan violated it." Single quotes. Hammond nodded thoughtfully. "That might establish Sullivan's involvement in the recent ambush, but it doesn't connect him to the Blackwood murders." "The man heard Sullivan speak of it," Matthew said. "When Sullivan realized I was traveling with Eleanor, he boasted to his men about how he'd handled the Blackwood problem years ago, and would do the same again." "Hearsay," Hammond sighed. "Admissible in these territories, but not the strongest evidence." "It's more than we had before," Matthew insisted, a rare note of urgency in his voice. "And there's more. The gunman says Sullivan keeps a journal records of payoffs, arrangements, including notes about the men he hired to burn my family's ranch." Hammond's expression sharpened with interest. "Where is this journal?" "Sullivan carries it with him," Matthew replied. "Never trust it to anyone else. If we can find Sullivan, we can find the evidence." Hammond completed the thought. He drummed his fingers on the desk, weighing his options. "The territorial cavalry is still searching for him. Given his wound, he can't have gone far." Eleanor leaned forward. "Your Honor, I believe Sullivan will do anything to prevent me from claiming my father's share of the mine. As long as he remains free, neither Matthew nor I are safe." Hammond studied her with newfound respect. "You've shown remarkable courage, Miss Walsh. Most Most women would have abandoned this pursuit at the first sign of danger. Most women haven't seen their father die destitute after losing everything, Eleanor replied evenly, or been falsely branded a thief and nearly hanged. I intend to claim what's rightfully mine. A ghost of a smile touched Hammond's lips. Very well. He turned to Matthew. I want to hear from this gunman directly. If his testimony holds water, I'll issue warrants for Sullivan's arrest on additional charges and authorize a wider search. And Eleanor's inheritance? Matthew pressed. Based on the documentation, her claim appears valid. I'll issue a preliminary ruling in her favor, though final disposition will depend on whether Sullivan can be brought to justice. Hammond rose, indicating the meeting was concluded. Returned to the courtroom. I'll have Miller bring in this witness. As they walked the short corridor back to the courtroom, Matthew placed a protective hand at the small of Eleanor's back. The simple gesture conveyed both support and a growing intimacy that neither had openly acknowledged. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, drawing strength from his presence. Better than I've been in years, actually. For the first time, I feel as though justice might truly be possible. His eyes softened as he regarded her. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Walsh. In good ways, I hope, she replied with a small smile. In the best ways, he affirmed, his voice low and sincere. The moment was interrupted as they reached the courtroom doors. Inside, Chambers paced impatiently, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. He looked up sharply as they entered. This irregular proceeding has gone on long enough, he declared. My client's rights are being violated in his absence. Your client's absence is his own choice, Matthew responded coolly. Or is it your position that Sullivan wasn't involved in the ambush at all? Before Chambers could respond, the doors opened again as Miller entered, escorting a man whose hands were manacled before him. The prisoner was one of Sullivan's gunmen from the Badlands, a hard-faced individual with a bandaged shoulder and the wary eyes of a predator who suddenly finds himself prey. Judge Hammond followed, resuming his place at the bench. Chambers, in light of new evidence, this proceeding will now address additional allegations against your client. You may remain to represent his interests. Chambers' face flushed with anger. This is highly irregular, Your Honor. I must protest. Your protest is noted, Hammond interrupted. Now sit down. The gunman, who gave his name as Frank Doyle, was sworn in. Under questioning from Hammond, he recounted the events in the Badlands, confirming that Sullivan had personally led the ambush with explicit instructions to kill both Matthew and Eleanor. Sullivan said the woman had to die before she could file her claim, Doyle testified, his voice flat and emotionless. And Blackwood. Sullivan said he should have made sure he was dead the first time, back in Texas. Did Sullivan specifically mention the Blackwood Ranch fire? Hammond pressed. Doyle nodded, said it was the cleanest solution to a stubborn problem. Told us how he'd paid 3 men to burn the place with the family inside, but that Blackwood had somehow survived. Said he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Throughout the testimony, Chambers made numerous objections, all overruled by Hammond. The lawyer's composure cracked further when Doyle mentioned Sullivan's journal. He keeps records of everything, Doyle explained. Names, dates, payments. Says it's insurance in case anyone ever turns on him. And where is Sullivan now? Hammond asked. Doyle hesitated, glancing at Chambers before answering. I don't know for certain, but he has a place outside town, a hunting lodge about 15 miles north in the foothills. He's mentioned it as a bolt hole if things ever went bad. Hammond turned to Miller. Deputy, assemble a posse. I want that lodge searched immediately. You can't possibly take the word of this. This criminal? Chambers sputtered, rising from his seat. I find his testimony compelling, Hammond replied coolly, particularly given your client's history of evading justice through legal technicalities. As Miller departed to organize the search party, Hammond addressed the remaining participants. This court will recess until tomorrow morning, by which time I hope to have more definitive evidence. Miss Walsh, Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you return to your hotel and remain there under guard. Miss Chambers, you are free to go, but I advise against attempting to contact your client. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor took a deep breath of the clear mountain air, feeling as though a weight had been partially lifted from her shoulders. Do you think they'll find him? She asked Matthew as they walked back toward their hotel. If he's there, Miller will find him, Matthew replied, his eyes constantly scanning the street for potential threats. But Sullivan survived this long by being careful. He may have already moved on. And the journal? Our best hope for proving his guilt in both cases. Matthew's expression was grim. Without it, it's still his word against ours, and men like Sullivan always have friends in high places. At the hotel, 2 deputies took up positions in the hallway outside their rooms, a precaution insisted upon by Miller before he departed. The afternoon stretched before them, a strange lull in the midst of ongoing danger. I should rest, Eleanor said, though sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. The day's events had left her both exhausted and exhilarated. Matthew nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. I'll be right next door if you need anything. In her room, Eleanor removed her shoes and lay atop the bed, staring at the ceiling as she replayed the day's events. The legal proceedings, while promising, felt almost anticlimactic after the physical dangers they had faced in the Badlands. Yet she knew the greatest threat remained. Sullivan was still free, and as long as he lived, neither she nor Matthew would know true peace. A soft knock at her door roused her from these thoughts. She rose quickly, expecting one of the deputies with news. Instead, she found Matthew standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. May I come in? He asked, his voice low to avoid being overheard by the guards. Eleanor stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Once the door closed behind him, she noticed the tension in his posture, the way his hands flexed at his sides. "What's wrong?" she asked. Matthew paced the small confines of the room before stopping to face her. "I've been thinking about tomorrow. About what happens if they don't find Sullivan or the journal. Judge Hammond seemed inclined to rule in my favor regardless," Eleanor reminded him. "It's not about the inheritance anymore," Matthew said, frustration evident in his voice. "It's about Sullivan himself. If he escapes again, ... He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Eleanor understood the fear that haunted him, that the man responsible for his family's deaths might once again evade justice, remaining free to threaten them both. "We've come this far," she said gently. "We have to believe justice will prevail." "Justice," Matthew repeated, a bitter edge to the word. "I've waited 8 years for justice, Eleanor. Watched Sullivan prosper while the law failed time and again to hold him accountable." Eleanor moved closer, drawn to the raw pain in his voice. "And what would you do if the law fails again? Hunt him down yourself?" "If necessary," he admitted, his gaze meeting hers unflinchingly. "And become a fugitive in turn?" She shook her head. "That's not justice, Math. That's vengeance." "Is there a difference when the law can't or won't act?" he challenged. "Yes," Eleanor insisted. "The difference is what it does to you. Vengeance consumes everything in its path, including the one who seeks it." Matthew's expression softened slightly. "You sound like you speak from experience." "My father sought vengeance against those he blamed for our losses after the war," Eleanor explained quietly. "It didn't bring back our home or restore our fortune. It only hastened his decline." She reached up hesitantly, her fingers gently touching the scarred side of his face. Matthew tensed but didn't pull away, allowing the contact in a way he might have rejected from anyone else. "These scars aren't just physical," she said softly. "I've watched you carry the weight of what happened every day since we met. Don't let Sullivan continue to define your life, Matthew." His hand rose to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "What would you have me do instead?" "Live," Eleanor said simply. "Build something new. Not just exist, as you put it before." The vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. This man who had faced death countless times, who had survived loss that would have broken many, stood before her now with his defenses finally lowered. "I'm not sure I remember how," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll learn together," Eleanor promised, her heart racing as she stepped closer. If that's what you want." Matthew's other hand came up to cradle her face, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew those hands possessed. "What I want," he said slowly, "is something I never thought I'd find again, something I'd given up hoping for." "What is that?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in the way he looked at her. "A reason to live rather than just survive," he murmured. "A future worth fighting for." The space between them disappeared as Matthew lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that began tentatively, then deepened as Eleanor responded with equal fervor. All the tension, the danger, the connection that had grown between them on their journey crystallized in that moment of contact. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Eleanor saw in Matthew's eyes a light that hadn't been there before. Hope, perhaps, or the first fragile beginnings of peace. A sudden commotion in the hallway broke the moment. Raised voices and hurried footsteps approached their door. Matthew moved instinctively, placing himself between Eleanor and whatever threat might be coming. The door burst open without warning, revealing Miller, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "We found him," the deputy announced. "Sullivan's at the lodge, just like Doyle said. Hammond's called for an emergency session tonight." His eyes darted between them, taking in their proximity, but he made no comment. "You're both needed at the courthouse immediately." As they hurried to follow Miller, Eleanor reached for Matthew's hand, squeezing it briefly. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything since their paths crossed in that Redemption Gulch courtroom together. Night had fallen over Santa Fe by the time they reached the courthouse, the building's windows glowing with lamplight against the darkness. A crowd had already gathered on the street outside, word of Sullivan's capture spreading through the small community like wildfire. The territorial marshal and his deputies formed a protective corridor through the onlookers, ushering Eleanor and Matthew inside. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air heavy with anticipation. Judge Hammond sat at his bench, his expression grave as he surveyed the assembled spectators. Chambers occupied his usual place at the defense table, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of strain, his collar wilted, his hair disheveled as if he'd been roused from sleep for this unexpected session. Miller directed Eleanor and Matthew to seats near the front, then took up position by the courtroom doors. Quote, the murmur of voices fell to hushed silence as Hammond gavelled the session to order. "This court is convened for an emergency hearing in the matter of Walsh versus Sullivan, and to address criminal charges against Victor Sullivan," Hammond announced. "Marshal, bring in the prisoner." The door swung open, and Victor Sullivan entered between two armed deputies. Eleanor's first glimpse of the man who had caused so much suffering was almost disappointing. He was of medium height and build, with silver-streaked dark hair and the well-tailored clothes of a successful businessman. His left arm was in a crude sling, evidence of Eleanor's shot during the ambush. Only his eyes betrayed the darkness within, cold, calculating, assessing everyone in the room as potential assets or threats. Beside her, Matthew had gone completely still, his face a rigid mask. Eleanor reached for his hand beneath the table, entwining her fingers with his in silent support. Sullivan's gaze swept the courtroom until it found them. A flicker of recognition, then disdain, crossed his features as he took in Matthew's scarred face. When his eyes moved to Eleanor, his expression changed to one of evaluating appraisal that made her skin crawl. "Victor Sullivan," Hamon said as the prisoner was seated, "you stand accused of multiple serious crimes, including attempted murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead?" Sullivan straightened in his chair, affecting an air of dignified indignation. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. These accusations are baseless, the desperate fabrications of a woman seeking to claim property that isn't rightfully hers, aided by a man with a well-known personal vendetta against me. We'll address those claims shortly," Hammond replied, unimpressed. "Marshal Taggart, please inform the court what was discovered at Mr. Sullivan's hunting lodge." The territorial marshal stepped forward, placing a leather-bound book on the evidence table. "This journal was found hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards, Your Honor. It contains detailed records of Mr. Sullivan's business dealings over the past decade, including some that appear to be of a criminal nature." Sullivan's composure slipped momentarily, his gaze darting to Chambers in silent command. The lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, any such document was obtained without a proper warrant and cannot be admitted as evidence. Furthermore, private business records are protected from. The search was conducted under my authority as territorial judge," Hammond interrupted. "And when those private business records detail criminal conspiracies, they are most certainly admissible." He gestured to the marshal. "Continue." Taggart opened the journal to a marked page. Entries from April 1867 detail payments to 3 men: James Kelly, Thomas Reeves, and William Stark for, and I quote, "permanent resolution of the Blackwood obstacle." Subsequent entries note additional payments to ensure their silence, and later arrangements for their relocation. When a Texas Ranger began investigating the incident, Eleanor felt Matthew's hand tighten around hers. The names of his family's killers finally spoken aloud after 8 years of searching. "The journal also contains entries from recent weeks," Taggart continued, turning to later pages, "including the hiring of men to track Miss Walsh, arrangements to have her discredited in Redemption Gulch, and ultimately, orders for her elimination when these efforts failed." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sullivan's expression remained impassive, but his eyes had hardened to flint. "This so-called evidence proves nothing," Chambers declared. "Anyone could have written these entries. There's no proof it's Miss Sullivan's handwriting, or that the book even belongs to him." "A fair point," Hammond conceded. "Marshal, was anything else discovered that might establish ownership of the journal?" Taggart nodded. "Letters in M.R. Sullivan's desk drawer, clearly in the same hand as the journal entries. Additionally, we found financial records that correspond to the payments detailed in the journal." Hammond turned to Sullivan. "Do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Sullivan rose slowly, adjusting his injured arm in its sling. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to persuading others. "Your Honor, I am the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. This journal is a fabrication, planted to discredit me because I stand in the way of Miss Walsh's fraudulent claim." He turned toward Eleanor, his expression shifting to one of paternal concern. "Miss Walsh, I knew your father. He was a broken, desperate man in his final years, prone to delusions and wild schemes. I tried to help him out of compassion, but he was beyond reach." Eleanor stiffened at the manipulation, the calculated attempt to use her father's memory against her. Before she could respond, Sullivan continued, addressing Matthew directly. "As for you, Blackwood, your obsession with blaming me for your family's tragic death is well documented. I've always sympathized with your loss, but your relentless pursuit has finally driven you to fabricate evidence against me." Matthew began to rise, rage evident in every line of his body, but Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand. "Don't," she whispered. "It's what he wants." Sullivan's gaze returned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am a respected businessman who has contributed greatly to the development of these territories. These accusations are not only false but malicious. I demand their immediate dismissal." "You are in no position to demand anything, Mr. Sullivan," Hammond replied coldly. "This court will determine the truth based on evidence, not your reputation or assertions." Hammond turned to Eleanor. "Miss Walsh, do you wish to respond to Mr. Sullivan's characterization of your father and your claim?" Eleanor rose, conscious of every eye in the courtroom upon her. She had not expected to speak, but now realized the importance of countering Sullivan's manipulations with her own truth. She moved to the center of the courtroom, facing Sullivan directly across the open space. "My father was many things in his final years," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Broken by war and loss, yes. Sometimes bitter, yes. But he was never delusional, and he was never a liar." She held Sullivan's gaze unflinchingly. "He wrote to me about his mining partnership before his death. Letters I never received because Mr. Sullivan ensured they were intercepted." She gestured to the journal. "Those records will show that my father legitimately owned 30% of the Silver Crescent Mina. Fact, Mr. Sullivan has gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal, including attempting to have me hanged as a thief and then murdered when that failed." Sullivan's facade of reasonableness slipped further. "Preposterous accusations from a desperate woman," he snapped. "Where's your proof that I intercepted any letters letters or arranged any so-called hanging. The proof is in your own handwriting, Eleanor replied calmly, and in the testimony of your own men who've turned against you. Men you abandoned to save yourself, just as you've abandoned everyone who no longer serves your purposes. She turned to address Judge Hammond directly. Your Honor, I came west seeking nothing more than a fresh start. I knew nothing of my inheritance until Miss Merhar Harrington found me. Since then, Mr. Sullivan has tried repeatedly to silence me, first through character assassination, then through outright violence. These are not the actions of an innocent man. As Eleanor returned to her seat, Matthew rose. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as his old adversary moved to the same spot Eleanor had occupied moments before. The two men faced each other across the courtroom. 8 years of hatred and pursuit distilled into this moment. Your Honor, Matthew began, his voice controlled despite the emotion evident in his face. For 8 years, I've pursued justice for my family. I've carried their memory and the failure to bring their killers to account with me every day. His hand unconsciously rose to touch the scars on his face. I resigned from the Rangers when the legal system failed to hold Mustar Sullivan accountable. Despite clear evidence of his involvement, he gestured to the journal. Those pages contain the truth I've sought for 8 years. The names of the men Sullivan hired, the money he paid them, the steps he took to protect himself afterward. Matthew paused, his gaze never leaving Sullivan. I could have taken justice into my own hands many times. There were moments when I wanted nothing more than to do exactly that. A tense silence fell over the courtroom as everyone recognized the dangerous admission. Even Hammond remained silent, allowing Matthew to continue. But that would have made me no better than the man standing before you, Matthew concluded. I ask this court to deliver the justice my family has been denied for too long, not vengeance, but true justice under the law. Sullivan's composure finally shattered. This is absurd, he shouted, rising so abruptly that the deputies beside him moved to restrain him. Blackwood has been hounding me for years with these accusations. The man is deranged, obsessed, and this woman is nothing but an opportunist, trying to claim what isn't hers. Sit down, Mr. Sullivan, Hammond ordered sharply. Your outburst only serves to undermine what little credibility you have left. Sullivan subsided, but the mask of civility had fallen away completely, revealing the calculating ruthlessness beneath. His eyes burned with hatred as he glared at Matthew and Eleanor. Judge Hammond studied the journal for several long minutes, turning pages and examining entries. When he finally looked up, his decision was evident in his expression. Having reviewed the evidence presented, I am prepared to rule on both matters before this court. Hammond's voice filled the hushed courtroom. Regarding the inheritance claim, this court recognizes Eleanor Walsh as the rightful heir to Jonathan Walsh's 30% share of the Silver Crescent mine, effective immediately. All profits withheld during the period of disputed ownership are to be calculated and remitted to Miss Walsh within 30 days. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, relief washing through her. Her father's final legacy had been preserved, his last attempt to provide for her future finally realized. As to the criminal charges against Victor Sullivan, Hammond continued, his tone hardening. The evidence in this journal, corroborated by witness testimony, establishes probable cause for charges of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, obstruction of justice, fraud, and numerous lesser offenses. Sullivan began to protest, but Hammond silenced him with a sharp gesture. Victor Sullivan, I hereby remand you to the custody of the territorial marshal to await trial before the circuit court on these charges. Given the severity of the crimes and the risk of flight, bail is denied. The courtroom erupted in excited conversation as the marshal and his deputies moved to take Sullivan into formal custody. The businessman's face was a mask of cold fury as he was led toward the doors, but he paused beside Matthew and Eleanor. This isn't over, he hissed, quiet enough that only they could hear. No prison will hold me forever. Remember that. Take him away, Hammond ordered, and Sullivan was led from the courtroom, his threats hanging in the air behind him. As the crowd began to disperse, Matthew turned to Eleanor, a weight visibly lifted from his shoulders. 8 years, he said quietly. 8 years. And finally, single quotes, words failed him. Eleanor understood. How could language possibly encompass the significance of this moment? The closing of a chapter that had defined him for so long. It's done, she said simply, reaching for his hand again. He'll face justice for all of it. Matthew nodded, something like peace beginning to settle in his eyes. And you have your inheritance. Your future is secure. Our future, Eleanor corrected softly, the word both a question and an offer. Matthew's scarred face softened as he looked at her. This woman who had entered his life unexpectedly and transformed it completely. Our future, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. As they left the courtroom together, stepping into the cool night air of Santa Fe, the stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, witnesses to an ending, but also to a beginning neither had dared imagine just days before. 3 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings and new beginnings. Spring had given way to summer across the New Mexico territory, bringing afternoon thunderstorms that briefly transformed the arid landscape with fleeting bursts of color and life. Eleanor sat at a small desk in her room at Santa Fe's finest hotel, reviewing the latest correspondence from Harrington. The attorney had been instrumental in untangling the complex web of Sullivan's business dealings and establishing Eleanor's control over her inheritance. The Silver Crescent mine had proven even more profitable than initially estimated, providing her with a monthly income that exceeded anything she she could have imagined in her previous life. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Matthew waiting, his tall frame filling the doorway. The past months had changed him subtly, the perpetual tension in his shoulders had, and though the scars remained, they seemed less prominent now, as if healing from within. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Lenore nodded, gathering her shawl. Together they walked through the hotel's elegant lobby and out into the sunlit plaza. Santa Fe had become familiar territory during their extended stay, its Spanish architecture and multicultural bustle a welcome contrast to the harshness of their journey. "Harrington says the final papers will be ready for signature tomorrow," Eleanor said as they strolled toward the courthouse. "The mine will officially be transferred into my name, and Sullivan's trial begins next week," Matthew added. Since their arrival in Santa Fe, he had worked closely with the territorial prosecutor, ensuring that every detail of Sullivan's crimes was documented and prepared for court. "Do you think he'll be convicted?" Eleanor asked, the question that had lingered between them for months. Matthew's expression grew serious. "The evidence is overwhelming. The journal alone would be enough. But with the additional witnesses who've come forward since his arrest, single quotes, he nodded firmly. "Yes, he'll be convicted." They reached the courthouse steps, pausing in the same spot where, 3 months earlier, they had emerged victorious from Sullivan's preliminary hearing. The building had become a fixed point in their evolving relationship, a place of justice, but also of transition. "What happens after?" Eleanor asked, turning to face Matthew directly. "After the trial, after everything is settled?" It was the conversation they had been circling for weeks, acknowledging their deepening connection while hesitating to define what might come next. Matthew took both her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses earned through years of hard living. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his voice low and intimate despite the public setting. "For so long, my life has been defined by looking backwards, seeking justice, nursing old wounds." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "And now I find myself looking forward for the first time in years," he admitted, thinking about building something rather than just surviving. Hope bloomed in Eleanor's chest. "What would you build, Matthew Blackwood?" A smile touched his lips, softening the hard lines of his face. "I've been looking at land north of here. Good water, decent grazing, possibility for a small ranch." He paused, gathering courage for his next words. "A place where a man might put down roots. Start fresh." "It sounds wonderful," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's eyes held hers. Vulnerability and determination mingled in his gaze. "It would be, with the right partner." The word hung between them, laden with promise. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as Matthew continued. "You asked me once what I would do after justice was served," he said. "I didn't have an answer then. I do now." He took a deep breath. "I'd like to build that future we talked about, Eleanor. Together, if you'll have me." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with emotion. This scarred, wounded man who had become her protector, her companion, her friend now offered something she had long ago stopped hoping for. A shared future, built on mutual respect and deepening love. "I can't offer you the life you knew in Virginia," Matthew continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I'm still a simple man with rough edges." Eleanor placed her hand against his scarred cheek, a gesture that had become familiar and precious to them both. "I don't want that life," she said firmly. "I want this one, the life we build together. However it takes shape." Relief and joy transformed Matthew's expression. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. He pulled her into his arms then, propriety forgotten as he held her close. When their lips met, it was a seal on promises spoken and unspoken, a commitment to the future they would forge together. The sound of a clearing throat eventually separated them. Judge Hammond stood nearby, his stern expression belied by the twinkle in his eyes. "If you two are quite finished," he said dryly, "there's a matter inside requiring your attention." Eleanor blushed but didn't step away from Matthew's side as they followed Hammond into the courthouse. To her surprise, the judge led them not to his chambers but to the main courtroom, the same room where they had confronted Sullivan months before. The room was empty save for a small group waiting near the judge's bench. Harrington, Miller, Marshall Taggart, and several others who had become allies during their time in Santa Fe. "What's going on?" Matthew asked, his arm still around Eleanor's waist. Hammond descended to his seat at the bench. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Walsh, it has come to my attention that you two have formed an attachment during your time in Santa Fe." Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks. "Your Honor, Hammond held up a hand, silencing her with a gentle smile. "No explanations necessary, my dear. In fact, I've taken the liberty of arranging something." He gestured to a side door. "Reverend Davies, if you please." The door opened to admit a kindly-looking minister in a black coat. He carried a small Bible and wore an expectant expression. Matthew looked from the minister to Hammond in confusion. "Sir, Mr. Blackwood," Hammond said, his formal tone failing to mask his satisfaction, "I have presided over enough trials and disputes to recognize when justice has been fully served. But true redemption comes not just from righting past wrongs, but from building something new." Understanding dawned on Matthew's face. He turned to Eleanor, his expression questioning. "I may be overstepping," Hammond continued, "but it seemed to me that you two might appreciate the opportunity to formalize your intentions before continuing with your plan." He gestured around the courtroom. "This room has witnessed enough pain and conflict. Perhaps it's time it witnessed something joyful as well." Eleanor looked up at Matthew, her heart full. "What do you think?" she asked softly. "I think," Matthew replied, his voice rough with emotion, "that I've waited long enough for happiness to begin." He turned back to Hammond. "Your Honor, We would be honored, though I'm afraid we're hardly prepared for a wedding. Sometimes the best decisions in life come without elaborate preparations, Hammond replied. The question is simple. Do you wish to be bound to one another, to face whatever comes as husband and wife? Matthew's eyes never left Eleanor's face. I do. And you, Miss Walsh? Hammond asked. I do, she answered, her voice steady and sure. What followed was simple but profound, a ceremony conducted without fanfare but with deep sincerity, witnessed by those who had helped them secure justice. Eleanor would later remember little of the formal words, focusing instead on Matthew's hands holding hers, the intensity in his eyes as he spoke his vows, the sense of rightness that pervaded the moment. When Reverend Davies pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The small gathering applauded, their happiness for the unlikely couple evident in their faces, while Mrs. F. Blackwood, Matthew murmured against her ear. It seems we've found our new beginning in the most unexpected of places, Eleanor agreed, glancing around the courtroom that had been the site of so much tension and now transformation. Later, as they stood on the hotel balcony watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and crimson, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a false accusation in Redemption Gulch to a wedding in Santa Fe, their path had been anything but conventional. Any regrets? Matthew asked, his arms encircling her from behind. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, secure in his embrace. Not one, she assured him, though I do wonder what comes next. First, we see Sullivan convicted, Matthew said, his voice determined but no longer consumed by the bitterness that had once defined him. Then we claim that land I mentioned and build our home. Our home, Eleanor repeated, savoring the words. It sounds perfect. It won't be easy, he cautioned. Ranching is hard work, especially starting from scratch. She turned in his arms to face him. Nothing worthwhile comes easily, Matthew. We both know that better than most. He smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face with warmth. When did you become so wise, Miss Blackwood? Perhaps when a certain scarred settler saw the truth in my eyes, she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. When he believed in me when no one else would. Matthew captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I saw more than truth that day, he admitted. I saw a future I thought was lost to me forever. As twilight deepened around them, Eleanor and Matthew Blackwood stood together at the threshold of their new life, a life built not on the ashes of the past, but on the promise of redemption. Behind them lay justice served. For them stretched a future limited only by their courage to embrace it. The story that had begun with a false accusation and a near hanging had transformed into something neither could have imagined, a testament to second chances, to healing that comes when wounds are shared rather than hidden, to love that emerges in the most unlikely of circumstances. And as night fell over Santa Fe, wrapping the newlyweds in its peaceful embrace, Eleanor knew with bone-deep certainty that their journey together was only just beginning.